time, and we have quite a bit on the agenda today. I'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all and discuss PCBs and building materials. My name's Emma Dexter. I'm the Sustainability Program Coordinator for the Seattle 2030 District, and I'm currently managing an education and outreach campaign that's targeting PCBs and building materials, and it's funded by the Washington State Department of Ecology and the EPA. We are recording today's session, so please know I'm happy to share both the recording and the slide deck with you all after we finish today. I want to start us off by giving you all a little bit of information about the organization I work for. So the 2030 District Network is a system of public-private partnerships comprised of property owners, building managers, services stakeholders, and community stakeholders. And there are currently 24 different districts across North America. We leverage these strategic partnerships to work toward a variety of different sustainability goals, namely a 50% reduction in energy use, water use, and transportation emissions by the year 2030. And we also work on a number of grant-funded projects focused on sustainability in urban environments, just like this PCB's education and outreach campaign. I also want to acknowledge our project partners and funding sources for our work. So from 2021 through 2022, the Washington State Department of Ecology developed resources to characterize and abate sources of PCBs within building materials, and the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts were awarded a grant through the EPA Puget Sound Geographic funds through the Stormwater Strategic Initiative lead to launch this education and outreach campaign for property owners and building managers about the risks of PCBs in building materials and equipping them to feel like they can use Ecology's tools for identification and abatement. I'm really grateful to be presenting here today as a continuation of that campaign. To share the purpose of today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on what and where PCBs are, the harms of PCBs in building materials, the responsibilities and the risks associated with inaction, and also the available resources and testing strategies to identify and dispose of these materials for the health of our communities and the protection of our environment. Today, I'm also joined by Dr. Dave DeSimone. Dave is the Toxics Reduction Unit Supervisor for the Washington State Department of Ecology's Hazardous Waste and Toxics Reduction Team. And for this one, Dave is mostly going to be a fly on the wall. He may chime in regarding the resources developed by Ecology and the EPA. He wasn't involved in the development of these resources, and we're both relative newcomers to the PCB space. We actually are sharing a 1-year work anniversary today, so this is a pretty cool way to celebrate that. But he will be joining us for workshops moving forward, and please feel free to direct any questions you may have for him during the Q&A portion of today's workshop. And then I'm also joined by Darian Highsmith. She's our Bellevue program manager, and she is here helping me monitor the chat. She'll help mitigate the Q&A, so know that she is here as well. To provide a brief outline of our agenda today, first I'm going to go over the basics of PCBs, what they are, why they were used, and when they were used. And then I'll go over some of the risks and negative impacts associated with PCBs, including consequences for human and environmental health. After that, I'll touch on the legal framework regulating PCBs at both the state and federal level, and address why some new requirements have recently been added, even though PCBs stopped being manufactured quite a long time ago. And then I'll walk us through a case study to demonstrate how testing and remediation played out at one site. It might be a site you recognize, we'll see. And then last, I'll touch on some of the available resources that have been developed by the Washington State Department of Ecology and the EPA to help building owners and property managers start this process. And as I mentioned earlier, we will conclude this workshop with a Q&A session. However, I'm happy to take questions kind of as they arise. So use the raise hand function, and Darian will let you ask your question, but I'm happy to kind of take those as they arise, or also just wait until the end. One last housekeeping item, you are eligible to receive continuing education credits for attending today's workshop. If this is something you're interested in, please email myself or the Seattle 2030 District's address. using this one on the screen. And the only caveat is that if you've already received a credit for an earlier workshop in this education series, you just can't earn more than one. So if that is something you're interested in, please let us know. We're happy to do that for you. Okay, now that we have all that covered, we can dive right into understanding PCBs. What are they, when, and why were they used? In short, polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, are a class of synthetic chemical that aren't found naturally in the environment. They were developed by Monsanto, which might be a name you're familiar with, and there are 209 different compounds within this class that all kind of share the similar base structure, and they're all just sort of different configurations of the same structure. They were added to building materials, namely to improve flexibility, adhesion, durability. Their chemical properties actually made them suitable for a really wide range of applications. And because of this, they were put into many different building materials from the 1930s until 1980. PCBs were used mostly from 1950 to 1980, and they can be used either in a liquid or a non-liquid form. So they can be present in things ranging from paint and caulking and grout to fluorescent lighting ballasts and many more materials, some of which are listed here in the table on the right. And while the manufacture of PCBs was banned in 1979, which we'll get into a little bit later, they can still be found in buildings built or renovated before or around this time. And this is because contractors continue to use stockpiles of contaminated materials that were kind of already in their possession throughout the decade. So consequently, buildings that were constructed or renovated between 1980 and 1989 are also at risk of containing PCBs, though this risk is much lower. Now let's explore a little bit about where PCBs are often detected and why this is important. So they're usually detected, or they can be detected on the exteriors of buildings, specifically in materials like paint and window caulking, as I already mentioned, and they can get into the environment through a variety of different ways. For example, when these sources are weathered, either by human or non-human sources, so think of like rain versus pressure washing, they can wash into our stormwater systems and eventually flow into our waterways. And this process sort of shows how legacy materials are still impacting our environment long after their manufacture was banned. And we'll get into this dynamic a little bit more later. But PCBs have been detected in via sediment sampling, both in stormwater drainage systems, as well as the Puget Sound and other water bodies in Washington, streams, rivers, lakes. It's a pretty pervasive issue. I wanted to include some examples of materials that were suspected of containing PCBs. These pictures kind of show like a sealant type that's been known to contain PCBs, this sort of rocky, pebbly texture to the building exterior is also pretty characteristic of the building vintage when PCBs were used. So this is something kind of to be familiar with. Like we were saying, and as you probably just saw in that diagram, there's such a wide variety of materials that contain PCBs, so it's hard to know for sure when you're going to find them, but I wanted to include some examples here. It's kind of just developing an eye for it, developing a familiarity with what kind of to look for and where to look for it. Here's some more examples of exterior building materials that were suspected of containing PCBs. I wanted to shout out Jasper. This is Jasper, the PCB sniffing dog. His handler, Julianne Ubigo, is the owner of Field Lab, which is an environmental canine detection service. And I had the privilege of collaborating with Julianne earlier this year. Jasper actually gave a demonstration at an in-person workshop we hosted in June. He's pretty incredible and he's able to detect when PCBs are present. He sits down if PCBs are detected, and he can really be a great tool to determine whether additional testing is recommended at a site. So Julianne can walk him around the perimeter of a building, and he can be a good indication of where and when testing might be required. So he's a great resource. And if you're interested in Julianne's work, I'm happy to share her contact information with anyone at the end of today's session. But I always want to include Jasper's work because I think not only is he an incredible tool, but also I think a great entry point into this topic. And if I had learned about Jasper earlier, I think I would have maybe wanted to learn more about PCBs earlier too. So I love to include him. And then here are just a few more examples. And though it's not really pictured here, I have been told by a few remediation professionals that a hallmark of spotting PCB containing materials is if it's still, shiny looking, sticky, gooey looking, even decades after if it was applied. So recall that PCBs were designed to resist heat, they were designed to be strong, a resilient adhesive. And in some scenarios, it means that these materials can still look really fresh and new, even though they're very, very old. So, this individual was talking about, a PCB containing material that was above like an exit sign, and he was saying it looked fresh. It looked like it had just been laid down yesterday. So that's a thing that might raise some flags. I also wanted to put PCBs within the context of some other hazards that you're probably all quite familiar with. So, like lead and asbestos, PCBs are regulated by different federal and state laws. They're also classified as hazardous materials that pose risks to human health, and they're all found in these older buildings constructed between 1950 and 1980. However, there are some qualities that set PCBs apart from lead and asbestos. So, one difference is that PCBs are synthetic, while lead and asbestos actually occur naturally in the environment, which honestly was kind of news to me. I did not know that asbestos was just naturally occurring in the environment. But in comparison, PCBs are also more expensive to remediate and they can be in a solid or a liquid form, while lead and asbestos are only found in solid forms. And this is all to say that even if you're hearing about PCBs for the first time today, you're likely already familiar with some of their defining characteristics, and you might already kind of know how to deal with them because you've handled other hazards in a similar way. So even though I might be introducing to them to you as if they were new, they've actually been around since the 50s. They were born out of the chemical inventions that followed World War One, or World War Two, just like many other chemicals we're kind of grappling with today. So I want you all to feel not that this is something new and scary, but it's actually kind of been around for a while, and you might know more about it than you think. Now that we have all that background covered, we can dive a bit deeper and discuss PCB's negative effects on human and environmental health. So, in order to fully understand and appreciate some of the regulations and recommendations pertaining to them, it's really valuable, I think, to understand the negative consequences of PCB contamination. So, PCB containing building materials can pose health risks and they contaminate stormwater, soils, sediment, and indoor air. They are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals with known health harms. So, being a bioaccumulative chemical basically means that they build up in animals and people over time through constant exposure, which causes them to become more concentrated in organisms at the top of the food chain. So, think of something like orcas. And this diagram is sort of a valuable way to kind of conceptualize it. It shows that, our PCBs start on our buildings and they sort of wash into waterways, and then once they enter waterways, they're first absorbed through smaller things like phytoplankton, which are then eaten by smaller fish, which are eaten by bigger fish, and ultimately end up in species like orcas or even people. And you can see that the concentrations get much higher as you move up, because obviously the orca is eating a lot of these fish, which ate a lot of these fish, and you can sort of see this reflected in the number of little PCB circles here inside the orca. So that's kind of a valuable way to think about this. And even though this diagram references the Puget Sound, this process plays out everywhere in different ecosystems. So like this indicates, PCBs affect salmon populations, southern resident killer whales, and sediment all over Washington. They take a really long time to break down, so they remain in the environment for a very extended period of time. And this means that the presence of this toxic chemical is going to really cause damage to the environment and living organisms until they're removed. And unlike other toxins that might degrade over time or, be broken down after being exposed to sunlight or other things, PCBs were chemically designed to be really resilient and stubborn. So they really stick around. And one thing that really stuck with me when I first learned about this topic was that there's no population of salmon in the Puget Sound with a permissible level of PCBs, which is pretty shocking. And we'll talk more about what that permissible level is moving forward. So even though PCBs were banned by TSCA nearly 50 years ago, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, many water bodies across Washington still don't meet water quality standards. And it's pretty shocking, but it was found that while the level of other toxics are steady or they're decreasing, PCBs in particular are still increasing. And after an investigation of this phenomenon, it was concluded that stormwater is the main pathway channeling PCBs to our waterways, and that external building surfaces are still these active sources of PCBs. We'll get more into this later, but it was kind of this huge puzzle for a while. Like, why are we still seeing these figures increase when we're not creating, when PCBs aren't being produced anymore? We're not, where are these elevated levels coming from? So, Ecology kind of conducted an investigation, and it's caused a lot of new knowledge about how we can address this issue. But before we go into that, I wanted to discuss some of the exposure routes for PCBs. And for people, the main exposure route is typically diet. And this is just through by consuming food contaminated with PCBs. Think of the fish that we saw in that diagram a couple slides ago. And individuals can also be exposed due to workplace repair, maintenance of certain items, improper PCB remediation and disposal projects, older appliances that contain and release PCBs when they're used, or, some electrical equipment accidents and spills. And there was a recent case of pretty acute PCBs exposure at the Sky Valley Education Center in Monroe, Washington. Some of you might be familiar with it, but students and staff reported some pretty severe health conditions. And this ultimately led to a massive settlement with Monsanto. So that's a case in which the exposure route was pretty much just direct exposure from leaky lighting ballasts. And as I've already alluded to, PCBs have toxic effects on the immune, reproductive, nervous, and endocrine systems in people and other organisms. They're known to cause cancer in animals, and they're very likely to cause cancer in people too. Even at really low concentrations, PCBs in water can affect aquatic life and human health. They're considered to be one of the most toxic chemicals in the Puget Sound. And first and foremost, this has led to fish consumption advisories, which you can see pictured here. Most commonly fished waters in Washington are contaminated with PCBs. I was just mentioning that detail about, the fish in the Puget Sound being contaminated. And so you might have seen these posted outside of, lakes, streams. I know I've seen them before, and outside of Green Lake. So as you can imagine, this has pretty serious consequences for a place like the Puget Sound and the Pacific Northwest in general, where species like salmon and whales are not only, an iconic species, but also a culturally significant resource. So it's not only a concern in that way, but it's also an environmental justice issue because communities in the Spokane area, for example, are unable to fish according to their treaty rights due to unsafe levels of contamination. And this issue has also caused several Superfund sites, which have been established and where cleanup is ongoing with the EPA, and those processes generally take quite a long time. So these health concerns in general just sort of highlight the importance of addressing PCB contamination, and they really demonstrate how there are so many different reasons to care about this issue. You can care about it from a regulatory standpoint or from an environmental and human health standpoint, from an environmental justice standpoint. So there's a lot of different entry points to this topic. There's so many different reasons to care about this issue. So wherever you're coming from, I hope that you can take something away from this. Now we can dive deeper into what is exactly this regulatory framework around PCBs. So we have both federal laws related to PCBs when it comes to their manufacture, their use, reporting, disposal, and cleanup. And there's also state rules related to disposal and cleanup. And both these federal and state laws aim at tackling sources of closed PCBs as well as their disposal and cleanup. And what they mean by closed PCBs are sort of just PCBs that are contained within a building material. They're inside the building envelope. They're kind of inside a material. They're not exposed. They're not moving around and sort of free flowing, but they're sort of locked in place at the moment. And different state and federal rules and regulations apply depending on what kind of piece of the PCB's abatement process you're looking at. So, different regulations cover different parts of PCBs, the closed versus the open PCB, and then being in the environment and trying to clean it up. So I already mentioned it, but the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, was enacted in 1976 and it went into effect in 1979. And this was the law that banned the manufacture of PCBs. TSCA was established to regulate the manufacture, the import, use, and disposal of different chemical substances, with the primary aim being to protect human health and the environment. And TSCA gives the EPA regulatory authority over hazardous substances, including PCBs. And specifically under Section 6 of TSCA, any PCB above 50 parts per million, or ppm, is not allowed to be used. So that sort of critical threshold I was talking about earlier, that is the 50 parts per million. And that's kind of the level you're looking for when you're testing. If you test for PCBs and you find a level above that 50 parts per million, that's when abatement is necessary and required. So as I mentioned, there's different laws regulating these closed PCBs versus open PCBs, and open PCBs are the ones that are kind of, maybe they're in water, maybe they're kind of free flowing, they were weathered off a building and now it's kind of moving around in the environment. So it was important to have regulations that targeted not only PCBs that were still enclosed in building materials, but also these ones that were sort of released and moving around. And so that's something that the water quality regulations actually target. So things like the Clean Water Act address PCBs as well. That's included in any harmful materials being released, and that is prohibited under the Clean Water Act. So um, it is important to recognize, I think, that currently building owners and property managers aren't required to test for PCBs. I've hosted a lot of these workshops, and several times I've gotten the question, like, wait, so I don't actually have to do anything, right? And while technically that might be correct for now, um, we like to offer up the benefits of taking a more proactive rather than just a reactive approach to testing. And through this work and talking with a lot of folks involved in this work, it's becoming clear that increasingly it's the industry standard to test for all hazards of concern, and it's routine practice and a requirement to test for lead and asbestos, as many of you I'm sure know. But before starting a demolition or a renovation project, it's becoming increasingly common for contractors to also ask that PCBs are tested for. And this is because they want to know what they're getting into. They want to make sure they're taking the proper precautions and that they're keeping their teams safe. And in this way, I've sort of also started to see not only just top-down regulatory change, but more of an organic shift happening in the building community in response to this hazard and the way we talk about it and the way we deal with it. And it's also true that waiting to test can often be more costly and also delay timelines. Say if you're in the middle of a, renovation project and PCBs pop accidentally or they're detected in your stormwater system, that's going to really throw everything off. And so avoiding that when possible and kind of taking on the costs of testing on your own terms is often probably a more productive approach to this. Returning to my earlier point, the Department of Ecology conducted an investigation and they were able to find that exterior building materials they remain active sources of PCBs and that stormwater is the main pathway channeling PCBs to waterways. So a variety of different studies have found this in areas across Washington, but also in other parts of the country. So here are some, there are lots of publications kind of showing this play out. And it's been found that this sort of phenomena is happening at a lot of places. And addition to the weathering and disrupting of PCB containing material, activities like demolition and renovation can also lead to greater discharges of PCB containing materials. And this is why, again, it's really important that you're testing for those things before you start these activities. And stormwater and drainage systems are really what can convey these PCBs from, not just the surfaces of buildings, but then to our surface waters, our sediment, our biota across Washington. So this process was it took a while to figure out, and there was sort of this connecting the dots moment that had to happen. So even though it was a little unsettling, I'm sure, to realize that these legacy materials are still impacting human health, they're still impacting our environment, figuring this all out was really important because it finally gave the Department of Ecology an avenue to turn off the tap, knowing where the problem is and where it was stemming from, they could finally design a strategy to mitigate it. And the way they approached this ended up being the MS4 permits and the Stormwater Manual for Washington. So recently, the Stormwater Manual for Washington was updated to include some language around PCBs, and this included best management practices for roof and building drains at manufacturing and commercial buildings. It also included washing and stream cleaning vehicles, equipment, and building structures. It included details about construction, demolition, and building repair. And you can find the link to the most recent stormwater management manual on Ecology's website. And we're about to talk a whole lot more about this. So it's really important, I think, to be aware of these guidelines and broader context behind PCB regulations. But you're probably wondering at this point, okay, what exactly do I need to do to comply with regulations? What are some actual action items? So now I'm going to go into these specific steps you should take to being in accordance with updated BMPs. And this kind of involved a three-pillar approach. So it involved first education and outreach. It then included illicit discharge detection and elimination, and finally operation and maintenance, specifically for municipal buildings. And this pertains to municipal stormwater permittees, but I think it's also useful for property owners and building managers to hear about this too, to learn how the landscape is really changing here. And so the first part of this was education and outreach. And it's, you're encouraged to use what's available. There's already so much information, and this involves sharing information from the Washington Department of Ecology with property owners and building managers. And there's a lot of resources on Ecology's website, including guidance docs, focus sheets, a cost estimation tool, as well as more resources on the EPA's webpage. So these two sites offer a wealth of knowledge on PCBs and strategies for testing, remediation. They offer a really great entry point for contractors, property owners, building managers, other stakeholders as well to learn about how to prevent PCBs from entering stormwater. And I also want to mention that my team, as part of this grant, developed a series of educational mailers highlighting these resources. We also developed a building list using publicly available assessor's office data for, buildings that are likely to contain PCBs based on their construction year or their use type or their size. So if you're interested in any of these materials, I'm happy to share them with you, and I'll make sure to mention them one more time before the end of today's workshop. But the second component of compliance had to do with guidance on washing down buildings, particularly limiting pressure washing. And this meant strategizing how to caution building managers and property owners against washing down their buildings unless they know it's free from PCBs. And so this might involve training folks how to identify a high-risk building based on characteristics like age and build type. I know when I showed those photos earlier, I mentioned, oh, this building kind of looks like one that often contains PCBs. So it's kind of developing a familiarity with what buildings of that vintage typically look like and knowing when to anticipate the presence of PCBs, learning what PCB containing caulk often looks like, what the paint looks like, specifically like yellow paint for some reason often contains PCB. So it's learning stuff like that. And the goal with this is to encourage folks to pause and think, is there a risk that my building contains PCBs? Is there a risk that I could accidentally violate the Clean Water Act, for example? Maybe I should test before I pressure wash my building and potentially allow my wash water to contaminate our stormwater system. So once sampling and testing has happened and it's confirmed, for example, that a building's exterior doesn't contain PCBs, then pressure washing activities can proceed as normal. But the point here is just to demonstrate that it's best practice to sample and test just in case. If PCBs are detected following testing, the two options are to either prevent managers and building owners from pressure washing or to prevent that wash water runoff from getting into the drainage system. So that might involve capturing that wash water and sending it to, a facility that can properly treat it. And I'm sure you've already thought of this, but there does exist a bit of tension between, clean building standards and regular building maintenance, making sure you're washing the graffiti off your building. So there is a bit of like navigating between these two things is part of this, making sure that your building is clean, but also that you're preventing PCBs perhaps from accidentally getting into the stormwater system. Here's just some additional guidance on washing down buildings. So covering again, not allowing wash water to enter storm drains. And you can cover storm drains, you can capture that wash water using a containment system. And there are some, depending on the level of PCBs potentially in there, you might be able to divert it to a landscaped area, but also there are facilities that treat this. And then finally, this is just an example of, portable wash water containment systems. That's one approach to doing this, using a setup just like this to make sure that that wash water isn't entering the facility, but also that you're able to clean your building. And then finally, the third component of compliance is factoring in PCBs during demolition and renovation of city buildings. And it essentially means that when you're planning these activities, PCBs should be kept in mind. It should be wondered whether they could potentially be present, again, depending on the construction year or the use type. If they fall within that window, if it was built or renovated between 1950 and 1980, then that's kind of your idea of whether you should be taking this into consideration. And again, just avoids accidentally violating things like the Clean Water Act. And these permit requirements in general were just designed to protect our drainage systems and our water safety. So now I'm going to mention and walk us through one case study where this played out, and this will give you a better sense of, for building managers and property owners, what this process actually looks like for testing and abating sources of PCBs. And it's the Rainier Commons, otherwise known as the Old Rainier Brewery. If you're in the Seattle area or if you've ever been driving on I-5, you've probably passed it, and you might have noticed there was some scaffolding up for quite a while, and this actually was a PCB's remediation project. So this site was a mixed-use development with 24 buildings on a 4.6 acre parcel, and it included both residential as well as warehouse spaces, storage spaces, and it was exactly the kind of site where PCB risks can be really spread across different structures and different materials. So back in 2004, actually, Seattle Public Utilities was just doing a routine sediment sampling in a nearby catch basin, and they found elevated levels of PCBs. And this is what triggered an investigation, and it ultimately traced back to the exterior of Rainier Commons. It was on the exterior of one of their buildings, and that sample came in at a staggering 213,000 parts per million, and that is well beyond the EPA threshold of 50 parts per million, as we talked about earlier. So that's a really high number. And over the years, additional samples had to be collected and abatement efforts were phased in. Ultimately, by 2014, the EPA had approved a general work plan, and the most contaminated buildings were being prioritized as much as they could be. And as of now, cleanup efforts are still ongoing. It's a long process. There are still, businesses and residents at this facility, so those things, people have to be moved out in order for these containment structures to go up and for, abatement activities to happen in a safe fashion. This was one of the earliest examples of PCBs remediation in this area, so I had the privilege of speaking to one of the people who worked on it, and she was saying that, a lot of lessons were learned during this process. And, hopefully now it's not going to take, 22 years to happen. But it was an enormous site, and we have the benefit of learning a lot from this. For example, we can learn that discovery often begins on the outside of buildings, and also that stormwater systems can really tell you a lot. This case study also really told us that cleanup is rarely a one and done situation, and it takes time, it takes planning, and persistent follow-up as well. So now we can talk more broadly about what this process generally looks like. And when you're on a site, the first step is kind of just to look for risk indicators. Again, start with the construction year, start with the building's use type, and then inventory any suspected materials. So looking at the paints or the sealants, the mastics, things like that. And at this stage, it's really important to document as much as you can. So taking photos, describing the condition of the materials, estimating the quantity of materials, and all of this will help you build up your sampling strategy later on, and it also keeps the project defensible. You should also check for any past reports or stormwater inspections that might have hinted at earlier PCBs discoveries. And after this comes the planning and sampling stage. So developing a testing plan based on your visual observations and also the building's risk profile. So testing needs to be done by or coordinated through an accredited laboratory, and the sampling itself must follow EPA and state protocols. And the results will kind of guide everything from there. It'll guide the scope of the removal, whether containment is needed, and which disposal rules apply. So, assuming you find PCBs above this 50 parts per million threshold, you need to develop a site-specific abatement strategy. So, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all process, which sometimes makes it difficult to talk about and difficult to answer questions because it depends so much on the characteristics of your own site. So, the method really needs to be based on the concentration and the type of material involved. So, it'll depend heavily on whether the PCBs are in a liquid form, whether you're remediating lighting ballasts, or whether it's in a solid form, if it's paint versus expansion joints, how invasive the process is going to be if you can just scrape it off outside your building, or if it's going to involve a more intensive process. So, for example, at the Rainier Commons, they used an abrasive blasting and hand removal tool under negative pressure containment. And that was really required to prevent airborne contamination or runoff contamination. Think of all the dust that would be generated from that, and all of that needs to be dealt with to keep not only the people working on it safe, but to make sure that those abatement activities are actually effective and not just spreading contamination around. So, during abatement, it's really important that detailed field notes are kept, that photographs are taken, and these are required for your final report. And they can really make or break regulatory compliance. So, after removal, proper waste handling and disposal is also key. PCB containing waste needs to be separated from non-PCB containing waste and transported to a compliant facility. And then the work zone also needs to be decontaminated after completion. And you also are legally obligated to keep all abatement records for at least 5 years. And they should include the sampling results, the disposal manifest, and a final abatement summary. And making sure you're doing testing after abatement concludes to make sure that those activities actually tackled the issue and that PCBs above 50 parts per million are no longer detected. So now we can talk about something everyone is probably thinking about, which is costs. And I want to start by saying that there is a cost estimation tool on Ecology's website that you can utilize. And this was developed several years ago in collaboration with our friends at Pacific Rim Environmental. And so this means that it does likely need to be slightly adjusted for inflation, but I think it was created in 2022. So it's still a really effective tool, and I encourage you all to try it out. But In general, PCB's abatement is not very cheap. The overall cost of a removal project really depends on several key factors, though. So, first is how much contaminated material you're dealing with. Are you talking about a few hundred square feet of painted exterior wall, or are you talking about an entire facility with PCB-laden sealants and mastics? And then there's also the concentration. So the higher the ppm, the part per million, the more strict the removal and disposal requirements are going to become. And the removal method also matters too. So like I was mentioning about the Rainier Commons, some materials can be removed under containment. Others might need full negative air enclosures and scaffolding, and that'll make for a more expensive remediation as well. And then you have to add to that the disposal route. Are you going to a Tosca landfill, a RCRA landfill? Are you using incineration? Each has different cost implications. And then finally, the site layout and the access play a role as well. So if it's a tight space, a multi-story building, proximity to occupied areas, that is also need to be that affects things as well and can drive up labor and equipment costs, or even like I mentioned with Rainier Commons, there were still businesses working out of that area when a remediation was going on. So that process not only added to time, but also cost. And it often can sometimes get overlooked in early estimates, but stormwater protection, if you're doing exterior abatement, you'll likely need to build temporary roofing or scaffold shrink wrap systems to prevent these PCBs particles from reaching our nearby storm drains. And all of this generally shows why early identification and planning are so important because it allows you to build a really realistic, project plan before work even starts. And then once abatement is underway, or better yet, during the planning phase, it's really critical to think about documentation and reporting. So the EPA does require a notice of cleanup completion to be submitted within 30 days of the final waste shipment. And this is just a formal notification that includes the site number, the cleanup approach used, certification that the work followed the approved plan. And beyond that, you also need a solid project file to support your compliance. And this will just include the summary of the source of contamination, how it was identified, which materials were effective, what cleanup methods were used, post-cleanup sampling results, the volume of waste that was removed and where it went. And again, keep in mind that these records need to be kept for at least 5 years, depending on federal and state guidelines, and they're legal records. So make sure your field teams are taking photos, filling out daily logs, tracking every disposal manifest. And it's worth noting, I think, that PCBs are a cradle to grave material. So this means that even after they've been sent to, a approved landfill, they are still technically owned by the same property owner or building manager. I'm afraid they're liable for that material forever. So good documentation is really helpful with this. Okay, this has been a lot of information, and I thank you all for bearing with me, but I want to begin to wrap up this portion of the content by just highlighting some of the available resources from the Washington State Department of Ecology, from the EPA, and also from the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts that can provide you with additional information and guidance and hopefully serve as a roadmap for you all when you leave today's session. So the Washington Department of Ecology provides various resources that can really help us understand, again, why PCBs were used in building materials, which materials are likely to contain PCBs. It includes a lot of the information I've sort of touched on today in much greater depth. And if you have specific questions about your unique site, this is a great resource to consult. It also includes frequently asked questions, guides on how to keep track of reports and regulations. So I encourage you all to check out this resource. There's a ton of information in there and you can sort of get lost in it, but it's incredibly rich. And then there's also many resources available through the EPA's PCBs webpage. And this material is a really valuable source of information for understanding PCBs as they relate to building materials, and they can help you manage and navigate your contamination concerns really effectively. I also wanted to include the contact information for Brett Feldhan. He is the Region 10 PCB coordinator, and Region 10 covers all of the Pacific Northwest. So, questions about how to proceed when PCBs above 50 parts per million are detected and how to properly report this, you can direct those to Brett's team, and he'll be really helpful when addressing those really site-specific questions that you might not be able to find an exact answer for just in these general materials. And then I also wanted to include some information about other toxics because I don't think it's necessarily productive to silo off PCBs from other hazards because they don't exist in a vacuum. Like I just mentioned, PCBs in relation to lead and asbestos, you're very likely to encounter something else if you're testing for these. So I wanted to include a lot of great resources here where you can learn more. And again, I'll be happy to share the slide deck with you all after so you can make use of these hyperlinks. And then finally, I already mentioned our target building lists, which include buildings that are likely to contain PCBs just based on their construction year, their use type. We also developed a PCBs education and outreach toolkit, and that was essentially a template of everything you would need to host your own PCBs workshop. So it includes a sample slide deck, outreach collateral, talking points, social media blasts, things like that. All of that was designed to be easily customizable to your area, your company, your branding. If that's something you're interested in, I'm happy to share that to you. If you're a municipal stormwater permittee and you're looking to fulfill your education requirement, that's a great opportunity. So please let me know if you're interested in any of the materials. I'm happy to share them with you. But I've been talking for a really long time, and I'm really excited to hear from you all now and answer any questions you might have. So, yeah, please let me know. We can look at the chat. Let's see. There was a little question about Jasper there, and he gets a ball. And actually, Julianne, she shared a little bit about her process for selecting the dog she trains because Jasper is not the first dog that Julianne's trained. She actually had another dog, and originally they were actually trained to detect wolf scat. They were part of a wolf conservation project, also a whale conservation project, and it was discovered that they could detect the PCBs inside the whale scat because again, the orcas were, ingesting these PCBs and it was appearing in their fat deposits. And then Julianne wondered, well, if they can detect it in whale scat, can dogs detect PCBs just on the exterior of a building? And it turned out that yes, they could. So uh, it's actually a sweet story. Jasper was rescued from a shelter, and the way she finds a dog that'll be a great candidate for this is what dog is incredibly motivated by the ball. Which dog is just hyper fixated on a ball, because that is a good sign for her of which dog can be trained really well. So I won't talk too much more about this, but it's something I always love talking about Jasper. So again, if I can share Julianne's contact info with any of you all, I certainly will. We got a hand raised.
Yeah, just a quick question about the Rainier Commons project.
Mhm.
Who paid for that? I know Seattle Public Utilities founded in the storm drain and EPA was involved, and I'm assuming Ecology and overseeing the project, but like who paid for it and how were they forced to start?
That's a great question. I can't speak totally to the details of that, but I think it was the owner of Rainier Common. They had to be the ones to pay for that process. And um it took a long time, I think, but since the PCBs were detected in stormwater, that did require it triggered a required abatement process. So I can't answer your question perfectly, and I think it definitely took a while to get started, but that's a great question of where is the burden of cost placed? So thank you for that question.
It, just to jump in here, Emma. So Dave DeSimone, Department of Ecology here. I'm not sure the person's name who's asked the question, but that is something that I could try to look into on my end as well. And if Emma, I know you're facilitating this full presentation. And so if you have a list of registrants and their contact information, if it is something I can track down, I know it is historic at this point. I can gladly look into it and provide any info to the contacts that are here.
That'd be great, Dave. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would
Sure.
appreciate it. My name's Andy, by the way. I work for City of Redmond. And I remember quite a long time ago, I used to work for Ecology and knew a few of the people at SPU, but I didn't know the drivers behind it because from the presentation, it kind of sounds as though this is all still voluntary unless it's a municipal building. And so like maybe Seattle has city code where they were going to do renovation of that building and that required them to do this. Because I'm imagining it's expensive. And so where does the flag get raised for any sort of private, redevelopment or whatever to then essentially require this as part of it? Because at least my understanding from the presentation is that at least federally and state-wise, PCBs aren't required to be mitigated in that way, but obviously a city could do it if they wanted to, or a county. But I'm just curious about that because I would imagine most buildings are privately held, in getting them to do this mitigation over time because it'd be
Yeah,
costly and they don't want to spend money.
sure, and that's a good point. It also, for clarity, would help for kind of a business model going forward to people having that information. And just to touch upon the other point regarding reimbursement or funding overall, the Department of Ecology does not for all projects, but specifically for school projects. If there are PCBs found in lighting fixtures, for instance, in schools, there is a reimbursement program that Department of Ecology does host and fund. There are some. Uh, I don't want the attendants to leave here today assuming that no matter what the project is, and no matter what the scope would be, that they will always foot the bill. I mean, there are methods to, again, depending on the scope of the project, um, uh, with regard to PCBs, that there are funding opportunities available for a different range of projects.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Looks like we have a question from Anne.
Yes, I just wondered if you could speak for a minute about the negative air enclosure, because I work with some jurisdictions kind of beginning to think about this PCB thing, and the pressure washing has been sort of the stumbling block because it's where people want to go, but very hard to control the water and all of that stuff. So we've been wondering what options could we encourage people to do because the water capture and disposal is a pretty big chunk, hard thing to get around. Go ahead.
That's a good question. I know that the negative air containment system is really good when you have a lot of airborne particles. So if there's going to be a lot of dust produced during the abatement activities, that's a great way to sort of prevent that dust from spreading. Then another way that people have done that is to, use water and wash down, and that's another way to kind of mitigate dust. But then you also run up against that same problem, which is how do you effectively capture wash water, which there are strategies to do that. I showed on one slide kind of what that system looks like, but you're right that it can be fairly cost prohibitive
Yeah.
to get that
Disposal
system in
of.
place, yeah, and then to dispose
Mhm.
of that so it can be
Yeah.
properly treated. So it
So
just
it's an airbag system like tented in plastic and they're wearing masks and something is absorbing everything that's being okay. So it's like a
that's what I
contained.
believe is there's like a
Okay.
negative pressure so that that air is kind of being like sucked out, and
Okay.
of course people will have, the proper PPE to make sure that they're not being exposed as well.
Okay.
And that's what one approach that's often taken. But yeah, it depends so much on what kind of material you're
Mhm.
abating, and that sort of dictates which strategy you need to kind of employ to make sure that you're uh
Right.
it all contained, been managed? But that's a great question, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions we can address? I don't see anything new in the chat. And again, if you have any other questions after you can process all of this information today, please feel free to email me with your question and I'll make sure it gets answered. I can also send a follow-up email with the slide deck. But any other final thoughts or questions related to anything mentioned here today?
Emma, I appreciate your sharing again, and I realize there's lots of resources here, and so as I swim through them and gather them to share with other people, as the education outreach coordinator on this topic here, I will be in touch. And I appreciate the slide deck to share because we're going to rewatch it in meetings and discuss it, and we'll keep coming to you with the challenges we face and how do we tell people the right thing. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
So
I'm
thank
excited to
you.
be involved. And we've developed lots of different outreach collateral with this
Hmm.
grant. So lots of
Hmm.
one-pagers and flyers,
Yes.
mailers. So if you can use any of that, I'm happy to share them with you because we'd love for these, to stay evergreen. This grant
Yeah.
runs through the end of 2026, but we would hate to see those materials just sort of lie dormant afterwards. So as much as we can share them and circulate them, that's the goal.
I think that's really important, and I'm going to be in touch with you about these because we're talking about creating them, but you may already have created what we need. So we need to look but carefully at what you have before we wander off in our own path. So
Certainly.
save our time. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
absolutely. I can share a whole portfolio with you.
We'll be in touch. I'll absorb all this and I'll send you an email.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. If there's no more questions, we can end today's session. Thank you all again for being here. I really appreciate it. And yeah, please email me with any other questions you might have.
Thank you.